Hey, welcome to Lecture for Research Methods. Just some advice here about writing the introduction section of a research proposal. So first, some basic stuff. The basic purpose of the introduction is to set the stage for the rest of the study, right? Because the proposal, you're proposing a method of answering some question, and how you would collect data and how you would analyze data. And that's kind of the second half of the proposal. The first half is the introduction, which is all about setting the stage for the actual study you would do. So if you're going to do a study, you have to have some problem, right? There's some question you're trying to answer. So you want to, in the introduction, identify what the problem is. Provide background information related to that problem. So what do we know about that problem? Why is it an important problem? All those sorts of things. And then the other thing that the introduction needs to accomplish is provide a segue into the method section. Right? So here's this problem, it's important, here's what we know, and then you have to get from there to here's what I'm going to do. Right? And that's where you say, okay, we don't know this, and it needs to be looked at this way, and then you can get into how you would look at it, which is then your method section. Right? From kind of a broad perspective, the basic metaphorical shape of the introduction should be a funnel. So you start broadly in terms of, if you're looking at, you want to look at whether or not marital therapy, cognitive behavioral marital therapy that's been shown effective in the States is effective with in the Philippines. You don't start off with here's what we know about marital therapies, CBT, the marital therapies that have previously been demonstrated to be efficacious in the States and have been tried with Filipino couples. You don't start with that. You start much broader. You start with something about marital therapy or about cultural differences between couples in the Philippines and those in the States. Right? So you start broad. And then you come down, you narrow your focus as you move through the intro to get to your study. So here's some big problem in the world, some issue at large. I'm not going to look at all of it. I can't solve all the world's problems in one study. But I'm going to provide the context for my one little interesting question. But I start with the large context and I work my way down to the specifics of my study. Some things to keep in mind regarding citations. Most of the introduction will be a literature review, right? Which means that the majority of the sentences will have a citation after them. If you see a sentence that doesn't have a citation, look at it and make sure, okay, it should be clear to the reader that this is my opinion, or this is something that I did or will do. Maybe it's your hypothesis or some statement about your method, or it's common knowledge. If it's anything else, it's like, well, people are like this. That better have a citation, because you can't just give your opinions and make them sound like facts in a research paper. It's not appropriate. So any kind of factual information should have a citation. And if you find that there's some fact that multiple studies found the same thing, you don't have to say study 1 found this, and study 2 found the same thing, and study 3 found the same thing. You just say the one thing once, and then combine all citations into one sentence. So research has indicated that blah blah blah, parentheses, cite, cite, cite. And you cite all of them, however many there are. Okay. Okay. Moving on to kind of a general outline of what the introduction might look like. You start off with the hook, right? Something that's going to bring the reader in, make them interested in what you're doing. And the hook needs to do two things. It needs to obviously grab the reader's attention, but it also needs to establish the need for or importance of research on your topic. Right? So you're not just doing research just to do research. There must be some reason for it. Either nobody's looked at this and it's a new question, or there's some problem in the world that you might be able to advise how to solve it if you gather this information, right? So multiple ways to do the hook, and this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a couple of ideas. One of the most frequently used tools, mechanisms, is to address some real-world problem, right? So maybe you'll cite some statistics frequently, but like for our study, maybe you make some statement about how people don't seem to interact with each other without some sort of technological interface. There's not as much face-to-face interaction as there used to be. If you find some stats on that, that would be great. Um, and that this might be a problem. And if there is some sort of problem, you can talk about the prevalence of the problem or the prevalence of the behavior. So how many people are texting or emailing, or or the other side of it, how many families are having face-to-face conversations today compared to 20 years ago? If you can find any research on that. And then you want to talk about potential consequences of the problem. Well, maybe if we continue doing this, if we don't have these face-to-face conversations, maybe it increases the likelihood of social isolation. And if you can find us somebody that said that, you cite it. And if not, you say it's possible that, and then you don't have to cite it. And that's your idea. You don't have to cite me. Maybe social isolation will increase and goes unnoticed because people don't have that FaceTime. Maybe less personal messages deprive people of important social interactions that are edifying in some way, which you could then probably look in the research and say, what's life like for people who have few friends and few social interactions and those who have lots of social interactions? Maybe we know that spending time with people in the real world is important for a healthy life. So some real world problem, how prevalent it is, what the consequences might be of not addressing the problem, or not at least finding out if it is a problem. Another approach would be to find some established theory that relates to your idea. Maybe find some theory about how people communicate, or about how feedback is processed and responded to. And then you want to address something about the theory. So maybe the theory is inadequate. Maybe the theory is inconsistent with your own observations or other data related to this particular set of behaviors. Right? Or maybe there's more than one theory, and maybe you can find conflicting theories. And this is kind of an ideal situation. Whenever you have two theories that predict different things, and you can test empirically and see which one is correct in this instance. Right? And then you also might just have it might be a new extension or application of the theory. Maybe people have said this about giving feedback, but nobody's ever looked at it with this new way of giving feedback because it hasn't been around very long. Maybe. And then kind of related to that, just broadly, your hook might be just that there's this kind of new phenomenon, a new behavior that is increasing with frequency, and we don't know what the consequences are. Right? Maybe there you can find evidence that texting as a primary form of communication is a fairly new thing, and we don't know what the impact is. So it's important to investigate if there are potential negative consequences in certain settings. Right? Okay, so once you've got them hooked, then depending on what your research is, you may have to define and clarify certain concepts. Sometimes there are divergent understandings in the research literature, especially if you're pulling together a lot of loose threads from a varied literature. You need to identify exactly what it is you're talking about. So when you're talking about, let's say maybe you're talking about texting. Are you talking about any textual communication, like a handwritten letter, or just text-based communication that's mediated by technology? And chatting, is that the same thing as instant messaging, as texting on a cell phone? What is it that you're kind of talking about whenever you're talking about these different concepts? And then maybe not so important for this study, but other studies often in our field will talk about mental disorders. We're doing research with clients with certain diagnostic categories. So you want to identify what you mean. If you're doing research on people who are depressed, well, you have to clearly define what you mean by depression. Do you mean the DSM-4 diagnostic category of major depressive disorder, or are you simply talking about depressive symptoms? And if so, you identify what those are, because there are differences in the research literature about how to define depression. So especially if you're talking about mental disorders, you need to talk about the symptoms, features that you think are important and that you're talking about when you're talking about something that might make people less depressed or more depressed. What do you mean by that word? Okay. And then just kind of a side note here, this defining and clarifying concepts in some papers might actually be your hook. It might be that, okay, people in literature have been talking about borderline personality disorder, and some people will see it as kind of related to this schizoid split. Other people think of it as a mood disorder. People disagree about what it is. This study will try to clarify what it is. So maybe that's maybe that's the purpose of a study, even, is to define and clarify certain concepts. Okay. If you need to do that, do that. You don't always need to. If your concepts are kind of clear, that may not be relevant. But then the next thing, regardless after you've done the hook, would be provide some context for the problem. So literature review for context. So what's the current understanding of the key issues? And it may not be very much literature out there looking at exactly the topic you're researching. So you talk about the variables that you're looking at. What does the research say about those variables? What does the research say about how technology use relates to mood or emotional well-being? What does research say about the impact of negative feedback on mood? Right? And if you can find connections between those, great. But at least talk about those two, the areas, that you're looking at in terms of relationships between your independent variable and your dependent variable. Not using those words, independent, dependent variable here, but the concepts and the constructs. So what do we know about the stuff we're looking at? Or is there any disagreement in literature? Are there discrepancies, right? Sometimes there is a consensus in the field about how people are and how variables are related. But this is rarely the case. Researchers love to disagree, and so usually you'll find differing opinions. And so if you present differing opinions, you want to resolve them and say, this person thinks this person thinks this. However, it may be that A is true in this circumstance and B is true in this circumstance. Or you might say it's unknown which is the correct interpretation. But you don't just say A thinks this and B thinks this. Right? You have to address that there is a discrepancy and either make sense of it or tell the reader that there is no way to make sense of it currently and that more research is needed. Right? Again, if there are any relevant theories, which you might have already touched on this if you used it in your hook, good to identify those and talk about how the theory explains what people should do related to these variables. Right? And then the key part in any introduction is identify the gap in the literature. So make sure you do this. Make sure you do this. Identify the gap in the literature. Right? Explicitly identify for the reader what question the existing research has not addressed. Right? Because this will be the justification for your study. And there's different ways of doing this. But basically, you want to say, we know this, we know this, we know this, but we don't know this. And in almost every article you find some sentence, to date, no study has conclusively demonstrated blah, blah, blah. Or the existing researcher has not addressed. Somehow they'll say there's some question that hasn't been asked. Right? And that's kind of the big flashing neon sign that says, here comes what I'm going to talk about. The gap in literature can be a couple things. Sometimes it's just nobody's looked at this question at all. Sometimes they've looked at the question, but not with a particular population. So maybe they looked at some treatment, just with one group, some sort of parenting intervention, and they found that it works. But they haven't looked at it with single parents. Right? So it hasn't been looked at in this population, and that's what I'm going to look at. Or maybe there's some variable that wasn't examined. Maybe, again, going back to parenting research. There's some sort of parenting intervention, and it's been demonstrated to be efficacious in reducing problematic behaviors in kids. But they haven't looked at whether or not it, in terms of how it works, why it works, if the parenting intervention works because the parents become more accepting of the children's misbehaviors, or is it because the parents become better able to decrease the unacceptable behaviors? Right? So looking at other variables that might explain the mechanism of something working or some other relationship. Or sometimes the gap in literature, maybe there's something wrong with the previous literature. So people have found this, but all studies have been limited in that none of them have been experimental, or they've all used too small sample sizes, or the materials they use were too artificial, and so it's not like the real world. So there's something wrong with previous research, and I'm here to address that problem. Right? There's that missing piece in the research. But somehow you need to say they've looked at this, this, and this, but nobody's looked at exactly this. And here I come to save the day. Right? Which brings you to another review of the literature, basically, to support your hypothesis. Now, there's two different ways to do this. Some writers like to introduce their hypotheses early on. Here's what I expect, and then they follow that up with, here's why I think it's true, and provide a rationale. Others prefer to build a rationale that leads up to a hypothesis. So you have, we know this, we know this, we know this, and therefore I think this. Okay. I think the latter way, building to a hypothesis, is better for me, but the former is certainly easy to do and certainly acceptable to do, and commonly done. So, but somehow you're going to be reviewing literature in terms of here's why I think something's going to happen, and you can either tell them what you think is going to happen at the beginning or at the end, but at some point you have to tell them your hypothesis. It's important to make sure you transition from the other kind of literature review to this literature review. Typically it opens with some sort of sentence like, in the present study, it's expected that blah, blah, blah. Or some people will use headings to identify a transition from the background to current. They'll have a heading that says previous research on couple interventions for couples suffering from depression and comorbid PTSD. And the next heading will be current expectations. They use headings to clearly say, okay, here's what we know, and then now we're going into what we're looking at now. You don't have to. You can just use a sentence, but somehow provide some transition from one section to the next. You'll probably be pulling from multiple bodies of research, diverse sources, not just research directly addressing your main topic. Because again, there probably isn't a whole lot of research there because you're doing it, right? You're the one filling the gap. So if it's a gap, there's not going to be a lot of stuff there, obviously, by definition. So to support your hypothesis, you're going to be pulling from a lot of different things and making connections between different bodies of research. So we know this, we know this. It seems likely that if this is true in this situation, and this is true in this situation, then if we look at the situation I'm looking at, this other thing would be true. And you have to make those connections, and that's where your own kind of creativity and knowledge come into play. Ideally, your support for your hypothesis is drawn from a theory, but it seems to be more and more rare in our empirical literature. But if you can, that's great, because theory testing is really what advances science. It moves science forward much more quickly than just looking at, okay, here's some things I think, and here's some observations, let's see if it's true. Right? Because testing theories has a broader impact on our knowledge than testing instances. Then, ending the intro, the last things you want to do, restate the focused research problem, exactly what you're looking at. Not, I'm interested in generally this, but exactly what it is you're looking at. Provide a brief summary of the design or method section. And method section. And this isn't all the details. You don't need to go into detail about the sample size and all that, but you want to tell them, if it's experimental or correlational. And if it's experimental, you need to tell them what you'll be doing to participants, right? So what the independent variable is and what effect you'll be looking at, what the dependent variable is. And you don't typically use the words the independent variable will be, the dependent variable will be, but you say something like, we're looking this study will look at the effect of this on this, right? And how those things will be operationalized, right? So this will be measured using this. Okay, and then this looks it's going to be off the slide here. Yeah, but the last point that you can't see there is identify your expected outcomes. So state your hypotheses. So at the end of your introduction, the last thing you should have there is it's expected that blah blah blah. That should be somewhere in that last paragraph. A clear statement of what you expect the outcome of the study to be. Okay. A few final thoughts. This outline is only a guide. It's not a checklist. You don't have to follow it slavishly or mindlessly. It's just, again, a general outline to give you some ideas of the kind of the key things that need to be are typically included in an introduction. The key to a good introduction is a logical progression of ideas. Right? The reader should be following along, thinking, yes, of course. Well, that is an important question. I can't believe no one's looked at this aspect. I think this author is exactly right in what she or he expects to find. Wow, this looks really good. This looks like a good way to answer the question in terms of describing the method. I can't wait to find out what they discovered. Right? Well, that's a bit melodramatic, but you get my point. You want to be kind of walking the reader along this path with you from, hey, here's something out in the real world that's kind of interesting, down to here's this problem. It's an interesting question. There's a really good way to look at it, and I'm going to do it. Right? And they should be following you all along the way. I always recommend writing an outline for your introduction before you try to sit down and write. Makes it much easier to, the introduction is the bones, the skeleton, and the text is the flesh. Much easier to have flesh that's going to stay upright if it's on a good set of bones. So start with an outline, which some people are willing to do, but then I also say what people are less interested in doing, finish with an outline. After you've written a draft of the introduction, go back, hide your original outline, get your introduction and say, okay, if I were reading this for a chapter in a book and I had to outline it, what would that outline look like? And see if you can, what happens when you outline what you've written. And if it matches your original outline, you're in good shape. If not, something got off, something got wonky somewhere, and you may need to make some changes. Okay. The other thing is, sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees when you're writing, especially when you're writing just text, and there may be some linkages between ideas that are easier to see if you're looking at an outline rather than looking at pages of text. And then the last thing is, don't expect to get it right the first time. I frequently find that when I write, I have to write a draft, I throw the whole thing away and then start from scratch, just because the first draft is me thinking out loud on the paper, and then I get it organized on the paper and in my head, and then I can come back and do it again. Hopefully you don't have to use the same process I do, because it's tiring, but expect to write more than one draft, a couple of drafts to get it exactly where you want it. Okay, that's all for now. Good luck.